In the midst of the difficulties of building the walls, Nehemiah had to deal with other internal and external troubles aroused by Satan. Nehemiah chapter 4 says, "When they began to repair the wall, Sanballat and Tobiah were very angry. They united with Geshem, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites, and mobilized the army of Samaria to fight against Jerusalem. All of a sudden, the Israelites were surrounded by enemies." Nehemiah, on one hand, led everybody to pray before God. On the other hand, he designed a thorough defensive measure.
Nehemiah ordered all the Israelites holding swords, spears, arrows, and bows to guard behind the walls. The enemies saw their determination and did not dare to attack. Chapter 4, verses 16 to 23 record, "From that day on, Nehemiah asked half of his servants to work on construction, and the other half wear the armors to stand guard. The builders had their swords strapped at their side while they built. The man who sounded the trumpet was beside Nehemiah, ready to alert everybody when the enemies attacked. Nehemiah stationed guards against the enemies day and night. Even when the workers slept, they did not take off their clothes, with their weapons in their hands."
In Nehemiah chapter 6, we find out the enemies went even more ferocious. They decided to murder Nehemiah when they saw the construction was almost done. "Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, 'Come and let us meet together in one of the villages in the plain of Ono.' But they intended to do me harm."
The plain of Ono is close to the east of Tel Aviv today. At that time, the Israelites who lived there did not belong to any province. They were directly under the governor of beyond the river. The enemies pretended to negotiate with Nehemiah and wanted to kill him at Ono, a neutral zone. The scriptures tell us that Nehemiah saw through the tricks of these people.
"So I sent messengers to them, saying, 'I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it to come down to you?'"
Then chapter 6, verses 5 to 7 say that the enemies wanted to further attack Nehemiah through an open letter. There were clay tablets from Babylonian era collected in the museum in Berlin. These tablets were put into clay envelopes stamped with seals. In addition, there were documents written on papyrus and sealed in the Persian era. An open letter can be a letter written on a clay tablet without a stamped clay envelope, or written on a papyrus that was not sealed. This is similar to an open letter today. The enemies used the open letter to spread rumors that Nehemiah led the Israelites to rebel. He built the walls to make himself the king. Chapter 6, verse 8 says Nehemiah refuted Sanballat by pointing out that those allegations were fabricated. At the same time, Nehemiah prayed to God, crying,
"O God, strengthen my hands." After the short prayer, the Bible no longer mentions about this event, implying that the plots against God have been all in vain. But these enemies did not give up. Finally, they tried to trick Nehemiah to hide in the temple, where only priests were allowed entry. They wanted to get rid of him with a trap for violating the law. However, Nehemiah had the wisdom from God that he saw through the tricks of his enemies. This is a silver scroll collected in the Israel Museum, on which the scriptures of Numbers are inscribed. According to Numbers chapter 18, those who violate the law shall be put to death. Nehemiah chapter 6 verses 10 to 13 records that Nehemiah refused to enter the temple. He simply ignored his enemies and only prayed to God for justice. This is what every servant of God should learn. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, in 52 days. And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. The time referred to by the scriptures was probably in October 445 BC. It took only 52 days to complete the project, an amazingly short period of time. No wonder the Gentiles, including the enemies of Israel, had to admit that the work was accomplished with the guidance and help of the God of Israel. In addition to oppression from the outside, the social disparity of wealth caused serious internal problems. According to Nehemiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 5, Nehemiah heard the complaints from the people while they were building the walls. The poor had to mortgage their homes, vineyards, and fields. Some sold their children as slaves because of the bad harvest and their inability to pay tax.
According to Leviticus chapter 25 in the Bible, when the rich lends money to the poor, they should not charge interest. In the year of Jubilee, the creditors must exempt all the debts, return the mortgaged land, and release those who sold themselves as slaves and their family members. These rules are meant for the rich to help the poor as much as possible. The Berlin Museum exhibits some documents of that era or even earlier. This piece of pottery fragment is a document of land registry on which the name of the owner of the land was written. This papyrus is a contract about the loan of a female slave. Another papyrus is a loan contract written in Aramaic in the Persian era. The creditor stated that if the debtor was unable to return the 4 silver coins he borrowed, the creditor would confiscate all the property of the debtor. These contents illustrate the fact of a big gap between the rich and the poor.
Nehemiah chapter 5 specifically mentions about the nobles and the officials. When they lent money to the poor, they charged lots of interest. Nehemiah was furious. Such social polarization, which was even more threatening to a community than a city without walls. Nehemiah chapter 5 verses 6 to 13 described how Nehemiah condemned the rich, pointing out that their behavior was against God's will. Nehemiah urged them to exempt the interest from fields, vineyards, olive orchards, and houses. They should return the money, grain, wine, and oil that they extracted from the poor as well. As a result, the rich swore that they were willing to listen to Nehemiah. I believe the key is that Nehemiah set a good example.
Chapter 5, verses 14 to 18 say, "When Nehemiah served as the governor from the 20th year to the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes' 12 years, he did not take his salary, unlike the governors before him, who used their power to tax people and purchased properties. Thus, Nehemiah uplifted the heavy tax burdens on the poor."
At Spring of Water International Ministries, we invite you to journey with us, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater. Isaiah 55:10. To find out more, follow Spring of Water International Ministries.